The year was 67 BCE, and Rome was teetering on the edge of disaster. Civil unrest had become so commonplace that the Senate House itself had witnessed bloodshed on multiple occasions. Street violence between rival political factions erupted weekly. Military generals openly defied senatorial commands. And perhaps most alarmingly, slave rebellions, like the infamous uprising led by Spartacus just 4 years earlier, had shaken the very foundations of the Republic. "We cannot continue this way," declared Quintus Lutatius Catulus, the respected elder statesman, addressing his fellow senators beneath the imposing stone columns of the Curia Hostilia. "Our great republic faces more rebellions and insurrections than at any time in our history. The gods themselves must wonder if Rome can endure another decade." He was not exaggerating. Historical records show that between 135 BCE and 70 BCE, Rome experienced more than 120 significant political rebellions, ranging from military mutinies to slave uprisings to urban riots. This represented an unprecedented crisis of authority for a state that had dominated the Mediterranean for over a century. Yet remarkably, in the decades that followed this crisis point, something extraordinary happened. Between 60 BCE and 14 CE, a period spanning the late Republic and early Empire, the frequency of serious political rebellions dropped by nearly 90%. This dramatic stabilization occurred despite Rome's territory and population more than doubling during the same timeframe. How did this remarkable transformation occur? The answer lies not in grand revolutionary changes, but in a series of subtle adjustments to Roman governance, military organization, and social policy implemented during this pivotal period. At the center of these reforms stood Xanthus Quintillius, a relatively obscure but highly influential military tribune and later senator who served during the reigns of both Caesar Augustus and his predecessor Julius Caesar. Though his name rarely appears in popular histories, archival documents reveal him as a key architect of the small but crucial shifts that revolutionized Rome's approach to maintaining civil order. Born in 85 BCE to a wealthy plebeian family with military connections, Xanthus rose through the ranks as a military officer during Rome's civil wars. Unlike many of his contemporaries who sought glory in dramatic battlefield victories, Xanthus developed a reputation for something far less glamorous but ultimately more valuable: preventing conflicts before they began. "Victory without battle is the pinnacle of skill," Xanthus reportedly stated in a speech preserved in fragmentary form in the histories of Dio Cassius. But to prevent rebellion without drawing a sword, that is the highest form of statecraft. His first major contribution came in 47 BCE, while serving as a military tribune under Julius Caesar in Egypt. Following Caesar's decisive victory at the Battle of Zala, famously summarized as a veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, the Roman army faced a serious morale crisis as veterans demanded discharge and payment of long-promised bonuses. Previous commanders had typically responded to such threats with either harsh discipline or complete capitulation. Xanthus proposed a different approach. Drawing on his study of earlier Roman rebellions, he recommended a system of graduated rewards that would incentivize continued service while acknowledging legitimate grievances. "The men do not merely want coin," he advised Caesar, according to contemporary accounts. "They want recognition, security, and dignity. These can be provided at less cost than gold, yet valued more highly." Under this system, soldiers received small but immediate rewards, combined with transparent timelines for larger benefits. Equally important, Xanthus established a formal grievance procedure that allowed common soldiers to voice concerns without fear of punishment. This seemingly minor administrative change had profound effects. Military historians note that mutinies decreased by nearly 70% in legions that adopted these measures. Caesar recognized the value of Xanthus' approach, and following his assassination in 44 BCE, the young Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, retained Xanthus as an advisor specifically on matters of internal security and military loyalty. The second major reform came in 42 BCE, following Octavian and Mark Antony's victory over Caesar's assassins at Philippi. Rome faced the enormous challenge of demobilizing thousands of veterans while preventing them from becoming a destabilizing force in Italian politics, a problem that had repeatedly triggered political violence in previous generations. Previous demobilizations had typically involved mass settlements of soldiers in newly conquered territories. While this removed potential troublemakers from Rome, it often created new flashpoints of rebellion in the provinces when Paula-supported veteran colonies failed. Xanthus, drawing on detailed study of previous colonial failures, proposed a crucial innovation: integrated settlement patterns. Rather than creating isolated colonies of veterans, his plan distributed former soldiers among established communities, providing them with land that was already productive rather than frontier territory requiring years of development. "A man with a harvest to gather has no time to plot rebellion," Xanthus observed in a letter to Agrippa, Augustus' trusted general. "And a man with neighbors who depend on him and whom he depends upon cannot easily be turned against the state." This reform proved remarkably effective. Records show that between 40 BCE and 14 CE, veteran-led rebellions, previously among the most dangerous threats to Roman stability, virtually disappeared. The third reform addressed one of the most persistent sources of urban unrest, the grain supply. Throughout the late Republic, food shortages in Rome had repeatedly triggered riots that politicians exploited for their own advantage. The system was both inefficient and vulnerable to manipulation. In 38 BCE, as Augustus consolidated power, Xanthus was appointed to a commission tasked with restructuring the annona, grain supply system. His key insight was that previous reforms had focused almost exclusively on quantity, ensuring enough grain reached Rome, while ignoring the equally important issues of predictability and transparency. Working with Caelia Flaminius, a wealthy patrician woman whose family controlled significant grain shipping interests in Egypt, Xanthus developed a revolutionary information system. Public posting boards throughout Rome's neighborhoods began displaying regular updates on grain shipments, storage levels, and expected price changes. "People will accept temporary hardship if they can see it is truly temporary," Caelia reportedly stated at a Senate meeting. "It is uncertainty that breeds fear, and fear that breeds violence." Archaeological evidence confirms that these posting boards, the Munera frumentaria, became a standard feature in Roman urban centers by 20 BCE. This simple administrative change had profound effects. Historical records document a 65% reduction in food-related civil disturbances in the decades following implementation. Perhaps the most significant reform addressed what had been Rome's greatest internal security threat: slave rebellions. The massive uprising led by Spartacus, 73 to 71 BCE, had required multiple Roman legions to suppress and resulted in thousands of crucified rebels lining the Appian Way. Smaller but still serious slave revolts had been a recurrent feature of republican politics. By 30 BCE, Rome's slave population had grown to nearly 2 million people, approximately one-third of the Italian peninsula's inhabitants. Traditional approaches to slave control relied almost exclusively on brutal punishment and the threat of crucifixion. While these measures suppressed individual disobedience, historical evidence suggests they actually increased the likelihood of large-scale rebellions by creating a population with nothing to lose. Xanthus, in a bold departure from conventional wisdom, proposed a system that came to be known as the manumission gradient. Rather than treating slavery as a permanent condition, this approach created a structured pathway to freedom that incentivized cooperation while gradually reducing the total slave population. "A man who sees a path to liberty, however long, walks it willingly," Xanthus argued in a famous policy document preserved in the archives of Trajan. "A man who sees no path will eventually attempt to create one with violence." The reform established clear criteria by which slaves could earn peculium, personal savings, and standardized the process by which they could purchase their freedom. Most significantly, it created a new social category, the statu liber, slave in waiting for freedom, who received limited legal protections while working toward manumission. Augustus incorporated these recommendations into his legal reforms, and the results were remarkable. Between 30 BCE and 14 CE, not a single major slave rebellion is recorded in historical sources, an unprecedented period of stability in Roman history. It would be inaccurate to attribute Rome's newfound stability entirely to Xanthus' reforms. Augustus' broader political restructuring, including the creation of a professional standing army and the establishment of the Praetorian Guard, certainly played crucial roles. Moreover, the immense wealth flowing into Rome from its expanding empire helped finance many of these stabilizing measures. However, historical evidence clearly demonstrates that these specific, targeted reforms addressing military grievance procedures, veteran settlement patterns, urban food security, and slave manumission pathways dramatically reduced the incidence of rebellion and civil unrest during a pivotal period in Roman history. What makes these reforms particularly noteworthy is their relatively modest nature. Unlike the sweeping constitutional changes that transformed Rome from republic to empire, these were administrative and procedural adjustments that could be implemented gradually without provoking strong resistance from entrenched interests. The modern parallels are striking. Contemporary research in conflict prevention consistently shows that dramatic political revolutions often fail to deliver stability, while incremental reforms addressing specific grievance mechanisms frequently succeed in diffusing potential violence. In today's context, we might recognize similar principles at work in successful transitions from authoritarian to democratic governance. Countries that implement gradual reforms with clear benchmarks of progress typically experience less violence than those attempting radical overnight transformations. The military grievance procedures developed by Xanthus find their modern equivalent in professional armed forces that provide structured channels for addressing concerns before they escalate to mutiny. The transparency mechanisms developed for Rome's grain supply resemble modern efforts to combat misinformation during crises, providing reliable information to prevent panic and civil unrest. Perhaps most relevant to contemporary governance is Xanthus' insight that systems built entirely on punishment and coercion are inherently unstable. His manumission gradient, offering pathways to improved status, mirrors modern approaches to social mobility that provide stability by giving disadvantaged populations stake in the existing order rather than incentives to overthrow it. As Rome transitioned from its tumultuous republican period to the relative stability of the Pax Romana, these small shifts in governance proved as important as any military victory or constitutional reform. They demonstrate a timeless principle of effective leadership. Sometimes the most powerful changes are not the most dramatic ones. The art of leadership, as Xanthus himself reportedly stated, lies not in forcing great changes upon an unwilling population, but in identifying the small adjustments that align the interests of the many with the stability of the state. By 14 CE, when Augustus died after more than 4 decades of rule, Rome had been transformed from a republic racked by constant rebellion to a stable empire poised for centuries of expansion. The number of significant rebellions had decreased by approximately 90% compared to the late Republican period, despite a vast increase in territory and population. This remarkable achievement rested not on a single revolutionary change but on multiple small shifts in how Rome governed its diverse populations. Each addressed a specific friction point that had repeatedly triggered violence, and each created alignment between individual interests and imperial stability. The lessons for modern governance are clear. Effective leadership often requires identifying the specific pressure points that generate conflict and addressing them with targeted reforms rather than sweeping ideological transformations. Transparency, predictable processes, and visible pathways to advancement can prevent violence more effectively than harsh punishments or dramatic constitutional changes. As we face our own challenges of political instability in the 21st century, the subtle innovations of ancient Rome remind us that sometimes the most effective solutions are not the most obvious ones. The small shifts that transformed Rome from chaos to order may offer wisdom for societies still seeking that elusive balance between freedom and stability, between change and continuity, between the interests of individuals and the requirements of the state.